Okay, I am mindful of everyone's time. I'm a big proponent of if we start on time, we end on time, if not a few minutes earlier. And I also want to acknowledge those of you and thank you, those of you who are in the room um, before the bottom of the hour. So welcome, just to make sure you're in the right place, welcome to a session titled From the Ground Up, Affordable Housing as the Building Block for Stability. My name's Tim Clont, and I am the new Director of Housing and Outreach for Rural LISC, and I am excited to facilitate the discussion that we're about to have. The work of housing is often measured in outputs, the number of units or projects created, or the number of home buyers or homeowners or families served. And those are important metrics, but they don't necessarily always capture the overall impact or the benefit of our efforts, especially over a period of time. But my colleagues in LISC's research and evaluation team recently completed a study that did just that. So I'd like this session to be as interactive as possible, considering the number of participants in the virtual platform that we're on. Our presenters, Nadia Villagran, Tom Colashau, and Patricia Vodolini, will each introduce themselves. They're going to share a little bit about their organizations and then present the study. I'm then going to field questions posted in the chat feature. And so therefore, as you have questions, please just go ahead and put them in the chat feature. I and the presenters can keep an eye on that. I in particular will, but as you have the questions, go ahead and ask them, and we will respond to as many as we're able to. So just a quick housekeeping. So chat feature, everyone should either have that at the bottom or at the top of the screens. We've been using it a lot throughout this seminar, so hopefully you're already familiar with that. Everyone's line was automatically muted when you came into the session, so please don't speak your question because I and the presenters won't be able to hear them. Okay. So pretty standard stuff. We've allocated about 75 minutes for this particular discussion. So depending on your time, depending on your time zone, that's going to be about 45 minutes past any hour. So with that, actually, before I turn it over to Nadia to introduce herself and get started, I'm going to ask Keegan to just go ahead and advance to the next slide. So to help set the stage for those of you who might not be familiar with California, our presenters are really going to speak deeply and specifically about the geography that you're looking at. But I just wanted to give everyone a visual reference, because this study really does focus on the Coachella and San Joaquin valleys of California. I was already a little familiar with these geographies, but I think seeing this map was really helpful. Just for comparison purposes, you can see the Coachella Valley down in the bottom, sort of the bottom left, and the San Joaquin, of course, on the left side. But even geographically, the sizes very different. Populations, housing needs and trends, very different. So you're going to see this slide again. Going into the conversation, wanted to give those of you who aren't familiar with California geography a quick lesson on that. So with that, Nadia, please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about the Coachella.
Sure. Wonderful to be here. Nadia Villagran. I'm actually with the Rural LISC team. I'm the Director of Fund Development and Strategic Partnerships for the Rural LISC team. But I have the unique perspective of being living in the Coachella Valley, and I was with the organization, the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition, for 14 years before joining LISC, and I had the unique and wonderful opportunity to help in the process of supporting the families that were building their homes through the United States Mutual Self-Help Program. in my tenure at CBHC and during the highlighted moments of the research project. So I have the inside track view of that process. And so that's why I'm joining you today. The Coachella Valley Housing Coalition, I should start with the Coachella Valley in general. The community it's a retirement community situated about 100 miles east of Los Angeles. And some even say, Palm Springs is one of the cities in the 9-city region. So a lot of people like to say that Palm Springs is the LA of the East. It's just an extension of the history of Palm Springs in this community is a Hollywood bedroom community. The Bob Hopes and the Frank Sinatra sort of made Palm Springs really popular. For those of you who haven't heard that story, the idea was that the Hollywood studios required their actors to stay within 100 miles of the studio when they were on vacation or off a project. And so Palm Springs was exactly 100 miles away. And so that's as far as people could get. And that's how Palm Springs became popular, and it's grown. It's one of those communities that has a very distinct disparity in terms of the wealth on one side of the valley, and then the need and the lack of resources and opportunities on the other. It also is a very being California, it's a wonderful land for growth and agriculture, and so it's the community that grows 99% of the dates that are grown in the United States. So there's a lot of palm trees and date trees. And then the table grapes, not wine grapes, but table grapes. There's a huge crop of table grapes that grow in the Coachella Valley. And so with that come many, many thousands of farm workers into the area, both seasonal and year-round farm workers. And so the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition was founded with the interest about 40 years ago to increase the number of housing units available that farm workers and their families could afford, with the idea that there were so many families living under trees and in their cars or traveling with the harvest because they didn't have permanent housing, that the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition and its founders wanted to provide more housing so families would consider staying in the Coachella Valley, finding their farm work year round, and then let their children be enrolled in school. And so that was a big focus of the founding members of the coalition. And I know there's although I can't tell from my perspective, but if there are members of the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition that are on this call, I know that Juliana Diaz was on an earlier session, so she can feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything on the history of the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition. But really, the point of the coalition was to provide affordable housing and for farm workers and other low-income families. And the mutual self-help program was just such a natural fit. It was a program that really focused on building the community from the ground up, and it just made a lot of sense for the farm workers and their families in the Coachella Valley. And so I think that it was extremely well received and embraced by the community, and all of those factors really contributed to the points that are made in the research project related to the program and then its value in the community, and then its potential growth and sort of what it spurred after that. I know we're going to get into more of that specifically with Patricia's presentation, but I'm here to share sort of the Coachella Valley perspective of this wonderful analysis. And then the other unique thing for myself is that I'm also the product of the Mutual Self-Help Program, having grown up in a mutual self-help home in Arizona. And so I can see it from both sides, as a kid watching my parents build their own home, and then as an adult in my professional career, helping families, go through the process of qualifying for the housing program and then becoming builders for their community and then homeowners. And so all of those efforts are near and dear to my heart, and I've seen it from the inside out. And so that's why I love this research project, because it was a very clear sort of analytical way of describing something that I knew was relevant in my own personal life. And so I'll just end there and let Tom take the rest, and then we can continue with questions.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Collishaw. I'm the CEO of Self-Help Enterprises. We work in the San Joaquin Valley, which, as you could see on the map, is a pretty vast area. The 8 counties, to give you some sense of perspective, is about the size of the state of West Virginia. San Joaquin Valley is often called the breadbasket of the nation. Tremendous amount of agriculture that's done here. It's also not considered rural because every county has a city that's over 50,000 in population. So if you look at a HUD map of metropolitan areas, that suggests that metro areas are not rural areas. None of the San Joaquin Valley is shown on that, even though it has vast rural areas and small communities. It is about, it's well over 50% Latino in population these days. And in the rural towns, those numbers approach 80 or 90% in many cases. Self-Help Enterprises started in 1965 after a successful pilot project of the American Friends Service Committee, which was really the first place in the United States where a mutual self-help housing model was used for farm workers in the San Joaquin Valley. And then the Self-Help Enterprises was incorporated in 1965. The study that you're going to hear more from Patricia about actually found some significant impacts that we've had in 2 specific communities. Next slide, please. One is Planada, which is a small unincorporated community in Merced County. I just threw a couple of pictures together so you get just a visual of a few things. The Bear Creek Housing Community was our first rental effort for rental housing. It was an old labor camp of the Del Monte Corporation. And we were able to take an old labor camp and turn it into 37 farm worker units with their own bathrooms and kitchens where none had previously existed in 1980. So that was our first effort around that. Next slide, please. Also wanted to put up, we are first and foremost a housing organization, but we learned pretty early on that we had to combine our housing efforts with infrastructure development so that you could provide housing in many of these small rural communities, such as Planada. We helped them get their first water system by providing technical assistance and leadership development locally. And then their new sewer, this was a big moment in 2015, where after 13 years of work, they were able to start on a significant sewer program that provided the opportunity to build additional housing there. We found it essential to go beyond housing to do infrastructure development and leadership development as well. Next slide. We've built many, well over 200 units of self-help housing since about 1972 in Planada with families providing the bulk of the labor. This happens to be a project that is underway right now. That's actually a congressman there in the background. And these are families that are building their homes in Planada. We have a 72 lot subdivision going on right now. The impacts overall of our work, to give you some sense, to date, we've helped approximately 6,400 families build self-help homes around the San Joaquin Valley. We've also been instrumental in doing major housing rehabilitation on another 6,700 units of single family homes, typically owned by low-income owners. And we've developed or purchased and operate over 2,000 rental housing units. So overall, it's about 15,000 housing units since our inception. Next slide. The other community that is highlighted in the report, next slide, please, is Wasco in Kern County. It's about 2 hours south of where Planada is. I would say that that was another place where there were significant impacts. We've done both rental housing and a ton of self-help housing in that community. Self-help housing has proven to be a wealth building strategy and asset development strategy for numerous families, and predominantly for people of color in the San Joaquin Valley. And so we still see it as a core value that we have, that working together, people can accomplish more than they can individually. Next slide, please. And this is the last picture, but Villa Hermosa is one of 3 rental projects that we've developed in the city of Wasco. Wasco is a small city. It's significantly larger today than certainly than Planada is. But overall, we've been able to build, and we operate about 150 units of rental housing at 3 different sites, as well as have assisted about 200 families in the development of their own self-help homes. So self-help housing is certainly a core value, and it informs all of our work at Self-Help Enterprises. And we insist that we work with rather than for the people that we care about in the San Joaquin Valley. And that's, to us, a core value that really stems from that work in self-help housing, but we incorporate that in all we do. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tom. Patricia.
If you could pass on the next slide, please. Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Voltolini. I'm a senior research associate with the LISC Research and Evaluation team. No, just a few before that, Keegan. Sorry, there's a little, one more. Perfect. The one previous. Perfect. Yes, that's the one I'd like to start. Thanks. Starting again, I'm Patricia Voltolini. I'm a senior research associate with LISC Research and Evaluation team, where I help evaluate impact of LISC communities across the country, and also provide research and evaluation support to our national programs and local offices. And today I'll be sharing findings from 2 of our companion reports that look at the impact of community development and affordable housing in the rural communities that Tom and Nadia just described. The first report is called A Home to Call Their Own, that looks at the impact of self-help housing at the individual level, and we'll be talking about some of the individuals featured in that study shortly. And the second report corresponds to the session's title, From the Ground Up, Affordable Housing as the Building Block for Stability in Coachella's and San Joaquin Valleys, and that looks at the impact of affordable housing at the broader community level. And I would like to start today's presentation by sharing the experiences of Alfonso and Heather that you can see here. They're both essential workers who, despite working long hours on important jobs, have long struggled to afford a home. And we learned about them through our report, A Home to Call Their Own, in which we documented the experiences of participants of a self-help housing program to help us better understand the impacts this participation has had on the lives of these individuals as well as their families. Alfonso is a farm worker who grew up in a small village in Mexico and has been working in the fields of Eastern Coachella Valley since the 70s, after leaving school at 6th grade to be able to support his family. Heather is a caregiver for those with intellectual and physical disabilities. She graduated from high school and has completed extensive vocational trainings. Originally from Bay Area, she's now based in Desert Hot Springs. As essential workers, the category of people who, until COVID were all too easy to ignore, right? Until the pandemic revealed how just our society depends upon them. They did not have the option to work remotely. Alfonso continued to report to the fields, even if COVID rates skyrocket among farm workers, and Heather continued to work at a residential care facility for disabled individuals, attending to their daily physical and mental health needs. A closer look at their lives reveals a very important commonality. Like many low-income residents in the Coachella Valley, they face serious challenges in their search for safe and affordable housing. Alfonso and his wife spent years working in the fields and moving from place to place on a combined income that often didn't reach $15,000 a year. The most stable home they found was a unit that was severely overcrowded, dilapidated, and had contaminated running water. Raising two children, Heather was also forced to move every few years whenever the rent was raised or her ex-husband lost his job. And at times, with no place to go, her only option was to move in with relatives. The experiences of workers like Alfonso and Heather are not unique, right? A study by the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that there's no state or county in the country where a renter working a full-time job at a minimum wage can afford a two-bedroom apartment. Next slide, please. Yet, Heather and Alfonso shared another important commonality in their search for affordable homes. Both have participated in a self-help housing program led by the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition. After decades of having to move frequently or contend with unsafe housing, both eventually found the homes they were looking for by building it themselves and are now homeowners. It's important to acknowledge that for individuals like Alfonso and Heather, homeownership or even housing stability seemed impossible until they were able to participate in the self-help housing program. Even with a steady job, both Heather and Alfonso's incomes were barely enough to find a rental unit, much less afford any kind of down payment to qualify for mortgage financing. The program, for those less familiar, which receives funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, opens up homeownership opportunities to families of modest incomes and who typically do not qualify for conventional mortgage financing. In a self-help housing program, groups of families or individuals, typically between 6 and 12, form an informal partnership to help build one another's houses under the guidance of a nonprofit housing development organization. With a construction supervisor on site, these building groups perform at least 65% of the construction work required to build their homes, a contribution typically known as sweat equity. In most cases, the nonprofit housing organization also provides construction and homeownership training and assists those families to qualify for their mortgage. Participants like Heather and Alfonso highlighted the challenges and the commitment it takes to go through the process. Each family contributes 20 hours of work per week on top of individuals' existing full-time jobs and family responsibilities like caring for children or aging parents. Most importantly, they also speak of the benefits and powerful impacts that the programs brings, from community building to housing stability and wealth creations for workers like Heather and Alfonso. They also emphasize how the process of building their homes together creates this long-lasting bonds with their neighbors and a strong sense of community. They emphasize also individually the transformational impact that building your own home can bring to an individual who until then had very little housing stability. So this sense of accomplishment and pride that comes with the process. Another relevant finding we noted is that self-help not only allows a larger segment of workers earning very low wages to afford homeownership, but also enables residents to develop valuable skills in the construction trades. Many people who learn about construction by building their own homes experience additional economic opportunities. For example, some were hired by the nonprofit organization, coordinated a program as contractors or site supervisors, while others ended up opening their own contracting businesses or supplementing incomes through occasional construction work. We've known from some time the powerful effects that housing stability can bring to individuals like Heather and Alfonso and their families, right? A home to call their own is one of many reports who have highlighted these impacts. But what we know about the impact of affordable housing communities more broadly at the community level, in particular rural communities where challenges for affordable housing are quite pronounced, is somewhat limited. Next slide, please. One more, please. Thanks. Even before the pandemic, over 8 million rural residents, or 1 out of 4, was considered housing cost burden, paying more than a third of their incomes in housing. The Coachella and San Joaquin valleys, as both Tom and Nadia illustrated, are emblematic of some of these challenges. Both are major agricultural hubs for the state and county and country, generating billions in yearly agricultural production, and yet a large segment of their population does not share in this prosperity. Nearly 20% of residents in Coachella Valley live below federal poverty line, and almost half of its residents experience housing cost burden. Similarly, in the San Joaquin Valley, almost 20% of residents live below federal poverty level, and 39 are experiencing housing cost burden. These regions are also home to the organizations you just heard about, the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition and Self-Help Enterprises, organizations that have been serving these communities for generations and helping address some of these housing challenges. Can you pass to the next slide, please? As critical as this work is, research on the impact, right, of developing affordable housing and community development in particular in rural areas has been quite limited. A handful of studies have demonstrated what we call positive spillover effects. But those studies have largely focused on urban communities. And so this paper has attempted to fill that research gap by examining community development efforts in these two California regions through a mixed methods approach. So through interviews with community development practitioners, local residents, civic leaders, and public officials, along with a series of statistical analysis included an adjusted interrupted time series of home mortgage values, we asked, what are the impacts of community development efforts on rural communities, and how can these efforts advance equity over the long term? And even though the cbhc and self-help enterprises work over vast geographical areas, as you've seen, we focused our study on a subset of towns where these organizations generated a level of affordable housing investment that could reasonably be expected to influence community trajectories as a whole, right? There's a threshold that we have to consider when selecting a place. And so as you've seen, these communities included the city of Coachella in Coachella Valley and Wasco and Planada in the San Joaquin Valley. And so just to summarize, whether our quantitative analysis focus on home loan mortgage values and trends as proxies for community reinvestment and stability, our interviews ask local leaders, longtime residents, and practitioners about the trajectory of these places and how they've changed over time through community development and affordable housing, giving us a more comprehensive understanding of community change and impact from local communities' perspective. Next slide, please. And so Coachella City has been one of Coachella Valley Housing Coalition's oldest community of focus, as Nadia mentioned. The organization began building homes there in the 80s to address lack of affordable homes for the farm worker population in particular. Today, Coachella City is a relatively large city of 45,000 people, but at the time, Coachella was a small rural town with a little over 10,000 residents, and its economy was heavily focused on agriculture. And when we looked at the trajectory of the city, we observed a few important things. So first was the scale of affordable housing production. So at the time that the report was published, the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition had built nearly 1,400 homes, which correspond to over 5% of the city's entire housing stock. And so this large footprint of affordable housing development has meant that the organization has been responsible for providing stable housing for a large segment of the population and played an important role in the city's growth. Interviewees shared a perception of positive growth, commonly noting that the production of affordable housing allowed low-income workers, in particular farm workers, to be able to create roots and stay permanently in the community. In turn, this increase in population supported the opening of new businesses, created new municipal services, and helped build the city's middle class. And this overall perception of positive growth across interviews was marked by important parallel changes or factors that were taking place in the city that they noted in connection with affordable housing. One was the investment and development of the city's infrastructure in the form of better public space amenities like sidewalks, parks, and as importantly, investment in the local public library and senior center. which are located downtown, very visible core locations. The other important factor were changes in political representation that took place at the same time. So as the city grew and stable affordable homes were being built, community development partners were also organizing and pressing for changes in political representation to have the city's leadership be more reflective of the majority Latinx population. And so first they were able to elect Latinx representatives for city council and school boards. And soon after, they were able to have majority of council and city administration boards composed of self-identified Latinx individuals. And so when we looked at our quantitative findings, they confirm these findings of revitalization and stability. So we looked at home mortgage values as reported through the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA, in census tracts that received affordable housing investment, and compare against local census tracts that did not. In our model, we also controlled for factors that could have affected these values, right? Such as property rates, investor percentage, percentage of renter occupied units, and population density. And what we found was that during the post-investment period, right? So right after the affordable housing was built, the mortgage values in census tracts with affordable housing increased about 10% more each year than in tracts without it. So our findings really indicate that affordable housing development helped change the trajectory of mortgage values in the community. Next slide, please. And when we look at the trajectories of Wasco and Planada, we found similar trends. So as Tom was mentioned, Wasco is a town of 27,000 residents in Kern County, and Planada is an unincorporated community in Merced County of about 4,500 residents. Over 80% of residents in both communities identify as Latinx. And self-help enterprises has been working in both places since at least the 70s. And similarly to Coachella City, interviewees overall share a perception of positive growth in both communities, noting that the expansion of affordable housing played a major part in that growth. While Wasco, when we published the study, had 253 affordable housing units built over the years, which correspond to 5% of the city's entire housing stock, Planada had 283 units built, which given its smaller size correspond to approximately 20% of its local housing stock. And so like the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition self-help enterprise partners with community-based organizations to provide a variety of support services to local residents, ranging from after-school programs, workforce training, and resident leadership programs, as Tom highlighted. In Wasco, community residents and leaders share perception of economic growth, noted increase in local retail and commercial amenities, and as importantly, noting changes in local political leadership to become more representative of the majority Latinx population. In Planada, unincorporation has meant that despite the expansion of affordable housing, the lack of existing infrastructure and lack of political governing bodies, so unincorporated communities are governed by their counties. This has meant that some of the changes noted in Wasco and Coachella were less pronounced here. And our analysis of home mortgage values in both communities didn't reveal statistical significant difference between the tracts that received affordable housing and those that did not. But given not in my backyard claims that affordable housing reduces property values, it's important to note that the absence of statistically significant difference between tracts with affordable housing and without also means that there's no evidence that affordable housing has any negative impact on local property values since they perform similarly. Next slide, please. And so why these findings are important, right? Why are some of the implications? Well, we found that these findings make the case not only that investment in affordable housing matters, but also the way in which it does. So they provide evidence of its impact, not just to individuals who live in those units like Heather and Alfonso and their families, but to the entire surrounding communities, right? As mortgage values stabilize, as infrastructure and services for broader community use are developed, and as economic opportunities expand. And since our analysis included both investments in rental as well as self-home ownership, they also speak about the importance of considering the mix between both types of housing, right? We didn't investigate statistically if there's a relationship between the two, for example, if there's an ideal balance or ratio between home ownership and rental units. But we found that through our interviews that having rental units help to anchor low-income families first. And so then through that stability and support services, many of them were able to move into homeownership opportunities. Next slide, please. And in the recommendation sessions, we present specific actions for key federal policies, which are more extended. Here is a very quick and short summary. So we wrote about the need for great investments to support the production and expansion of affordable housing, both rental and homeownership self-help units. We also wrote about the need for flexible and reliable funding streams to equip rural and unincorporated communities and the organizations working with them to address their infrastructure challenges. We also wrote about the need for more robust funding for capacity building, not only for organizations, but also for the municipalities themselves, and suggest allocation based on need instead of the current competitive application process that tends to privilege places with higher capacity. We also wrote about the need for intentional and meaningful community investments in resident leadership, development coupled with institutionalized opportunities for residents to exercise that leadership. Since it was so prominent in places like Coachella and Wasco in particular. And we also wrote about the need for intentional discussions among counties and municipalities around structural changes needed to enable fair representation, including direct election as opposed to city council appointment of mayors, as well as establishing district-based election rather than citywide election if a particular community feels underrepresented in the community political process. And so with that, I pass it back to Tim.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our presenters. Oh, Keegan, yep, very good, thank you. So I'm curious, I'm going to first let me scan the chat really quickly. And again, encourage any participant with questions to just go ahead and ask them in the chat. And I'll keep an eye on those and pose them to our panelists as they come in. But I'll go ahead and get started. So, Tom and Nadia, you represent the two organizations that were the focus of the report. And I know that you were very engaged with the research and the development of the report. But what are your reactions to the findings? Were you surprised? Did the report validate really what you already knew? So talk to us about that.
We weren't surprised, but it was sort of wonderful to have some of that in serious research, because we know these stories after doing this for 55 years. We hear from people all the time. I meet somebody every month who said, my parents built a self-help home, became the launching pad for my siblings and I to, improve our lives, get education. We were able to borrow money to start a business. We hear those stories all the time, but they're anecdotal. And it was really nice to see sort of what we knew to be the case to be verified.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think one of the big things that we do, right, as part of this work is advocate for affordable housing. And we're talking to anyone who will listen, right, about the value of investing, supporting, getting involved with affordable housing in your community. And so there's a lot of intuitive understanding of the value of this and a lot of conversational understanding of the value of this program and this affordable housing effort in a community, but to get to see it in writing, right? To look at it from an analytical perspective with the impacts of values in terms of property and in terms of contribution to a city's growth and its city's leadership was just, if nothing else, it was just like an aha moment. Like, yes, that's exactly right. This is what I've been saying all along. Now I can prove it and I can claim a document to reference, right? As we're having those conversations with whoever will listen, but elected officials and city officials and all the above. And one of the other things the Coachella Valley Housing did is it created a scholarship program. I know that Tom, your group also has one, but we did that with that in mind, that idea of we need to get to the stories. We need to get to the people who lived in the housing, who benefited from the stability that that housing program created. And we need to hear their stories. But the best way to do it is to also contribute to their success. And so the Coachella Valley Housing started a scholarship called the John F. Neely Scholarship Fund. And it was really super beneficial to get high school students to share with us what it meant to them that their parents had built a self-help home, and then to also then be able to keep track of those brilliant students as they were going through their educational process. We were giving them money, so they were benefiting from the relationship too, but then we were able to say, I have the valedictorian of 3 of the 5 high schools, and I have, living in a mutual self-help home. We are supporting in scholarships, US University of Southern California and UCLA and schools from across the country that were benefiting from these self-help grantee families, and so it was just another way of sort of validating the value of this program. And I just think, being able to contribute to this research project is just one more way for us to advocate for affordable housing. So.
And Nani, before we move off of you shared with us at the beginning of this conversation that you're the product of a self-help family, right? So I'm curious if, thinking back to your experience growing up, growing up in a self-help community, having parents, who built the house that you lived in, if this, the findings in the report really sort of validate, confirm your experience in growing up in a self-help community.
Yeah, I think you guys, some of you may have been inundated with my story on being a mutual self-help family byproduct, or I used to say poster child, because Suzanne and Arde did a story, and then Liz did a story, and so my mom's very proud. But and I should add to that, Pedro Rodriguez, who's on this call and is the CEO of Self-Help or Coachella Valley Housing Coalition, sorry. He's been adding the facts on cbhc to the chat. So thank you for that, Pedro. And I apologize, you should be the one doing this. But just to answer your question, Tim, for me, being a product of the Mutual Self-Help Program is one of the highlights of my personal experience. I really attribute a lot of my family's success and stability and ability to keep my sisters and I moving forward in the right direction, the direction my parents wanted us to go to when they came here from Mexico when I was 5 years old, is because I think of the Mutual Self-Help Program and how important it was to not make the decision about, do we buy food or do we pay rent? Do we pay for this medical bill? Do we pay rent? That kind of thing. But the other side of it that I think is really important is that organizations like Self-Help Enterprises and Coachella Valley Housing Coalition didn't walk away from the families once they built their homes. It's a relationship that lasts throughout this process. It's a 30 to 55 year, and plus relationship. And I think that's actually been the one lesson that I realize is most important about the program is my experience, the community that we built when I was a kid in Arizona. There was a little bit of a disconnection, I think, between the organization and the families. And so they had to build that network beyond once they were in their home amongst themselves. So my family, my community, we all talk to each other and we sort of take care of each other. But what I've seen with Self-Help Enterprises and Coachella Valley Housing Coalition is that they also are part of the mix, helping, advocating, pushing forward. When predatory lending came through, in the early 2000s, Self-Help Enterprises and cbhc called the families and said, listen, these notices are not good for you. This is not the best option for you as a homeowner. And that's not something that the community that I saw in Arizona or I lived in Arizona had. And so that's just one example of the ways that sort of staying with the organization as a nonprofit has really meant the most benefit for the families involved in the program.
No, I think there's tremendous value to that because so many organizations spend a lot of energy on creating new home buyers, creating new homeowners. And it's the post-purchase supports can often be just as important, especially since many of the home buyers that are assisted through these programs are first-time homeowners, right? So it's their first time experiencing this, and it's so helpful to have a trusted advisor in another organization. So thanks for that. There was a question or question earlier in the chat, and I had a similar one that I'm going to pose to Tom and Nadia, recognizing that both of the organizations, both Self-Help and Coachella Valley, are involved not only in creating homeownership opportunities, which really was the focus of this report, but also significant multifamily or rental housing development as well. And so I wonder if you could just speak to the relationship between the two. Do you use your rental housing as somewhat of a pipeline, if you will, of homebuyers or self-help participants for those who want to become homeowners? And just sort of speak about the relationship between those two types of housing tenures. And I'll have Tom go first.
You want to go? Yeah. Okay. Great.
Sure.
Yeah. Our rental housing folks on staff are always terrified that their best tenants are going to be stolen once we do another self-help project in town. But in seriousness, actually, Bear Creek and Planada, my understanding was the original residents, about half of them went on to build their own self-help homes in Planada in subsequent projects. It's not always that high, but it has certainly been a rich place, and we're often providing homeownership education on our rental sites so that if people are desiring to move into homeownership, we want to give them the tools to do so. There's certainly no judgment on our part for people. We don't think that that's, homeownership is for everybody. But I think one of the things that Self-Help Enterprises and CBHC has done well is to sort of embrace a spectrum of housing needs and opportunities by continuing to encourage home ownership, but also providing housing across the spectrum of other needs. And most recently for us, that has meant also including serving formerly homeless folks in our rental projects and creating permanent supportive housing opportunities. And so it's just, again, expanding that spectrum of ways that we can serve. And then for some people, it will be a continuum and they can move through that to home ownership. And we think that's wonderful when that happens.
Yeah, and I would add that, and Pedro, feel free to let me know if I got this right. But I know in my experience with Coachella Valley Housing Coalition, those waiting lists in the rental housing developments, that was a great indication of the need, and it spurred that spectrum of activity in terms of affordable housing. So if you had, and CBHC did have hundreds of families on a waiting list for a community in Coachella, they knew they had to build more rental housing in Coachella. And then they had to go to those families that were living in the rental housing and say, hey, you're ready for home ownership, and get them to that process, right? And sometimes it's convincing folks that it is for them because there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about it. That way, then there's always sort of that flow of activity. So you're opening up rental units for families who need that rental product, and then you're giving those stable families that opportunity to be homeowners, so that we're constantly trying to serve that list of families that need the help and need the support. And that, unfortunately, that list never gets smaller, right, Pedro? It's like just a constant flow of families, but it's just such an important part of the work is getting that unique relationship with the families and then helping them through each stage of their homeownership process.
I agree with Nadia. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please share.
So we usually have about a 10 to 20% success rate. We do such a good job at our affordable housing developments that people are comfortable, right? We provide services. We provide after-school program. We have educational, computer literacy. So a lot of our families don't want to move out, right? I mean, we have a lot of our original tenants that are still at the multifamily development. So, but we do provide regular recruiting. We go to the projects, and like Tom said, some of our best residents are the ones that get transferred over because they have the credit, good credit, and they have the income, and they're willing to put in the hours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sure. No, I think, that's an important, reminder for a lot of us, especially those who work in homeownership programs. I think we acknowledge that not everyone wants to be a homeowner. Not everyone aspires to that. And even if someone does, sometimes it's a longer runway for some folks, especially maybe those with more moderate incomes, where it's going to take a little bit longer to amass some type of a down payment or to work on some credit issues. So I think it's great that both of the organizations are absolutely, using their rental housing as a source, right? Because these are individuals who you have an experience with. Chances are that maybe they've spoken to some of the other self-help homeowners. And so, they've gotten, some assurances, that it is everything it's cracked up to be, right? It is a great opportunity. So I see, I see a raised hand. I'm trying to, I will tell you, I am monitoring video, chat, and hands all on a laptop screen that's balanced on a box of Kleenex. So it's a little precarious in here, but I've got it. And I do see Brian Ketchum's hand up. So Brian, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Sure. Well, this was just more of a comment.
Or make your comment, sure.
In the context of what is that percentage of kind of conversion from renter to homeowner? We see a similar rate. We have both multifamily and single family program. And I would say our average is probably in that 10 to 15% range. But I would suggest that percentage is lower than it might otherwise be due to other eligibility issues related to families, which could be documented legal status that impacts their eligibility to get into a lending product. I think we have a number of families that would otherwise qualify, but because of the uncertainty around legal status, that kind of skews those numbers even lower. But I just wanted to reiterate the power of this paper and having an opportunity to point to research, as we're doing community presentations that supports what we as practitioners know to be true, but having that kind of statistical analysis around it is really impactful. So I'm grateful for your work and again, celebrating just the incredible impact that both organizations have had in their communities.
Great, thanks for that comment, Brian. And I mean, Patricia, would you, hopefully you would agree, that much of what you looked at in this study, sort of the data, the stats, all of that, is largely replicable in other rural communities, especially those with CDCs, nonprofit housing developers who have some history, right? They have some production history that they can look at over a period of time.
Hi, Tim. Yes, it is a replicable model. We've used this model to look in other places. For example, we use a similar methodology to look at the impact of LISC's investment in South Minneapolis, not a rural community, but it's a model that have been used. And, as I mentioned in the report, has been mostly used in urban areas. And you can ask my colleagues, Francisca and Spencer, who did the magic in running the models. And so I want to acknowledge their great work here. And yes, it can be replicated elsewhere. The main challenge with understanding rural impact are the challenges around data availability, are the challenges around the size of census tracts, which sometimes may dilute impact that you might see in other places because of a similar size. So there are methodological challenges, but it's definitely something that can be replicated elsewhere.
Good, thank you. There was a question in the chat a little bit earlier, I'll paraphrase, but it was if or how a self-help program might be used as employment training. How many have you had? Do you have stories of self-help participants maybe who went on to work in the trades or some other related industry?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, we've had numerous folks that have become construction superintendents. We have 2 on our staff currently who help other families build their homes, but came to the program building their own home with limited construction experience. We can often start them as sort of an apprentice level as a staff person, and our construction staff will point them out and say, we've got somebody who's really good in this group and we'd love to recruit them. So we've done that numerous times. We've also had staff who have done loan packaging for other families. We have 2 on staff right now that are helping additional families do what they did as self-help home builders. And then we've heard a number of stories about folks who went in to other business. One prominent local cabinet maker actually built a self-help home and ended up running a successful cabinet shop for about the last 30 years. So there are those kinds of things, but we also think that people just gain self-confidence often, and that is reflective in what they go on to do with their lives, and they don't settle as maybe as once they would for certain employment opportunities. So we just see an empowerment aspect for so many people who participate in the self-help program.
Yeah, and I would echo that too. I've definitely seen it both in my personal life with the families that I grew up with, and also with the Coachella Valley Housing Coalition. I used to love to take folks on tours of affordable housing in the Coachella Valley, and you could always tell when there was a skilled laborer or whatever. It could be bricklaying, it could be stonework, it could be landscaping, and that group of self-help homes got the full benefit of that skill level during the construction and after the construction. And I just think, you know, that community spirit of sharing your skills, and then also just that empowerment of knowing that you built this house, right? And so it's like an example of your skill, and also just that ability to say, I can do this for every level. And I know that from when I was a kid, you know, just seeing my neighbors and their children my age, but their parents, you know, starting small businesses, you know, really recognizing that they had more to offer than even they allowed themselves credit for, because of this just great endeavor that they took on. And then also recognizing that you're not alone, right? I mean, my community is largely immigrant families. And so to some extent, there's like this feeling of loneliness that comes from being an immigrant from another country. And all of a sudden you have this community through the self-help program that then reminds you that you're not alone, that you can ask for help, that you can support and be supported in a way that builds in all levels of your life. And so I definitely just
I appreciate those. Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Nadia, because you know, I think many of us use the shorthand self-help housing, but as a reminder, its formal name is mutual self-help housing, right? And so that word mutual really is a powerful word, right? And it does really speak to a sense of community that is developed during the year or longer, some shorter, you know, period of time that it takes for this cohort of new neighbors to work on each other's homes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then you have that lasting benefit. You know, rare is it, especially nowadays, that any of us move into, let's say, we buy a home off of an open market, maybe in a small subdivision, rural community or not. And we might meet one neighbor, you know, in the next few months. We might meet the other one across the street or something, but it's rare that you would walk into your home on day one and be able to point to not only 10 of your neighbors and know them, but to be able to say that you work on all of those houses too.
Oh,
right?
I
mean,
can
just
tell you
talk
from
about
experience. I had 6 grandmothers who watched me and my sisters at all levels of my childhood, good and bad. And then my dad, who was a skilled carpenter, he installed the cabinetry in many of the houses in the homes that we built. So he would go into people's kitchens and say, hey, stop slamming the doors. I installed that cabinet, you know, and things like that. And so it's just a lot of sort of personal connection that goes beyond what you normally see in a neighborhood. And so it was really nice as a kid.
You know, and on that mutual aspect also, whereby you know, individuals or families are working on each other's homes over a period of time. And for a not an insignificant number of hours every week, right? I think, what is it, 20, 30 hours a week? Tom?
40 for us.
40.
Per
Okay.
household, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, and a lot of these families are otherwise working, right? So maybe they're going in early so they can get out a little bit earlier, and then they put in a second shift on their home or their neighbors' homes. So I just wonder what type of accommodations are made, if any, for participants or potential participants who may not be able to devote that many hours to do the physical labor that others might be able to, maybe because of age or disability or some other limitation. So how do your programs accommodate those individuals?
Well, what we require, the 40-hour a week requirement, any owners of the property. So if there are 2 owners, we do require 10 hours from each of the owners. And if there's just a single owner, then you'd get 10 hours from that minimum. And then they can get approved helpers. And so it's very typical that they have either children or other relatives. Sometimes they have people from their church. They have other friends who commit to the project. But we're pretty militant about the 40 hours because it just is what works. We will accommodate certain work schedules, and it's not unusual for people to start their workday on the site at 3:30 after they get out of the fields. But in the summer, they could work until 8 o'clock at night and put in many of their hours that way. We also don't really allow people just to do weekend work. They've got to show us that they and their helpers can provide some of the help during the week as well. But we accommodate for folks who physically cannot do the labor, even if they're going to be an owner. We do allow surrogates, but we're pretty insistent upon the work hours. It is a work program. The houses don't get built unless everybody is doing the labor and working on each other's homes.
Yeah.
And Pedro, maybe you want to share a little bit of how CBHC structures the work?
Oh, we're pretty much the same way. We are finding out that it's as we move into the non-agriculture communities, the residents, the people in those communities have different jobs. They work at hotels, they work in the medical industry. It's a little more difficult for them to get off early. We try to provide a letter for the employers to let them know that they're participating in the program. But we are seeing that, they're not able to put the 40 hours, as Tom says. I mean, we'll 30 to 35 is basically what people are doing. But some of the things that, we also have single parents that are joining the program, because this program does not discriminate. So they have to provide a volunteer, right, that's going to put in the other 20 hours. And we're seeing some of those volunteers don't continue with helping them out. So then the other families have to come in and help out. But it is a little more difficult in the non-agricultural field areas, like in Desert Hot Springs, for instance. But we tried. We definitely tell them it is a work program. It's part of the requirement from USDA that the families have to put in the hours to build their homes. But one of the things that since I just came in, I'm trying to see if we can try to get volunteers to help out those single mothers that are not able to put in their hours. That's a program that I'm trying to see if we can pursue an ongoing pool of volunteers that can come in and work on the weekend and help them to finish their homes.
Good, thank you for that. I see a comment in the chat maybe about how accommodations are made in other parts of the country for self-help housing. So that's helpful as well. I also saw some comments in the chat from other self-help housing programs that also spoke to some success stories as it relates to program participants moving on to trades or other types of related employment as a result of their experience in self-help. So that's good. I'm going to do a time check. We have about 8 minutes left. Here I was concerned about filling 75 minutes, and this has been pretty easy for me, so thank you all. I'm going to pause also very quickly and scan the chat because I'm going to try and have our participants respond to as many questions as possible. Does look like, just some some comments around how nice it is to humanize some of the self-help participants, humanize their stories, hear from Nadia about her own personal story. And I do want to remind folks of a companion publication that was recently released in conjunction with the report that is the focus of this conversation. But Patricia mentioned it at the beginning. So from the ground up, which I will drop the link in the chat again right now, so you can all read the study if you haven't yet. But there's a companion piece that came out with it that really humanizes some of the stories. And Patricia showed images of two of the individuals at the beginning of her remarks. And so for those of you who have commented that it's been nice to just hear some of the stories, it's a nice piece to read. And it really just shows at least in that particular piece, the different type of participants. I think one of the one of the individuals highlighted in the story, don't quote me, but I think he was 70 years old, maybe in his 60s, maybe almost 70, and building and owning his first house. And then, and he had adult children, and then you had someone else who at least visually appeared to be maybe even half his age, right? And she had a completely different story. And I always enjoy humanizing so much of our housing work. So Pedro, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to highlight that the other self-help participant was a great story. Mr. Countryman, he was a veteran, Vietnam War veteran. He was homeless at one time, stayed in his truck. He moved into one of our units in the Coachella Run apartments in Palm Springs. So he went from there. He was one of the graduates from the rental housing to mutual self-help. And then he's very active in the community. He's one of our board members. He participates. I mean, that to me is an incredible story. And that's a perfect example of what the impact of the mutual self-help has on families. So please read his story. He's one of our best board members, always contributing, willing to help out. We talked about community, that group is a community. We mentioned how the kids go and play ping pong in some of the residents, they throw darts in his house, and that is really a true community program there. So I was very proud of him. And thank you, Patricia, for that report. One of the things on the impact that I think was that was not mentioned, during the market crash in 2008, a lot of private developers stopped building homes. So they left finished subdivisions, they let them go. So we came in, we bought 205 lots in the city of Coachella. Those lots would have been empty then. But because of our program, we were able to get the finished lots at a reasonable price, and we made it work. So we completed an existing subdivision of 205 homes. And while the construction business was completely down, we were still building. We were still building houses. We were bringing in revenue to the cities in terms of permits. We were keeping subcontractors busy. There's another aspect of the program that creates such an economic impact for independent contractors. We use plumbers, electricians, stucco people. We just kept all those people busy during the time. So I think that's a great testament to our program.
Yeah, great. No, thank you for that. For anyone on the line or on the call that has maybe an interest in self-help housing, you're exploring it, maybe you're just getting started. I just want to remind you that one of the many benefits of being a Rural LISC partner organization, if you are, is your access to some peer-to-peer connections. So if you'd like to be connected with maybe a more experienced self-help housing provider, or you're looking for some self-help resources, knowledge resources to get you started, please do reach out to us and we'd be happy to make some of those connections for you. So we are almost right at time. I do want to thank Tom and Nadia and Patricia and our participants, all of those who asked questions, who chatted something in, or who just listened for the last 75 minutes as well. So thank you all. for your participation. Again, links to the study in the chat. So please do take a look at that when you have a chance. And I'm seeing some clapping hands on camera, so thank you for those. Hopefully our panelists are seeing those as well. And I hope you've all enjoyed the session and the rules seminar. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.